We're getting ready to take this 88 Jeep Wrangler. We're going to update the fuel system. We're going to replace the carburation that's on it now with a Howell fuel injection system. The Howell system comes out with a reconditioned GM throttle body. They provide all the wiring, the connections, the sensors, and a detailed set of instructions. So what we're going to do again is update this thing a little bit. While we're out on the trails, while we're making some steep climbs, we're going over some rocks as well as some of the traveling that we do with it to higher elevations. We don't want to have to mess with the carburetor or some of the issues that come with it. So we've reached out, got this Howell system that we're going to put on it. Follow along, we'll show you how we do it. This reconditioned GM throttle body is going to be one of the two main components of this fuel injection system. This right here is actually going to replace the carburetor, and then either high on the firewall or inside the cab, we will put the electronic control module. What that does is it does the calibrating. It sends the signals to all of the components via the wiring that we're going to install to adjust everything on the fly, which is how an electronic fuel injection system works. Okay, before we get started taking off the old carburetor, removing some of the other items, what I wanted to do was just kind of show you what comes with the Howell EFI set. Again, the reconditioned GM throttle body unit, as well as the electronic brains behind the operation that I spoke about. This right here, you want to make sure that it's mounted somewhere high, dry, and safe, because in here, nothing but electronics. Now, they send fuel lines, the base for the throttle body, all of the stuff that's necessary, and as mentioned, a wealth of knowledge as far as the instructions go. So this is your step-by-step on the install. We're just going to show you how we do it as we follow along with those. There's some other components. Now again, the wiring, everything is terminated. It's pretty much a plug-and-play system. There will be just a couple small connections that will need to be made, but everything is labeled, so that makes it handy and simple. The fuel pump. Now, one of the first things that we need to do, that we will do on this before we go too far, this is an O2 sensor. This little, what is called a bung, has to be drilled and mounted by a weld into the exhaust pipe. This reads the amount of oxygen, so that computer can make the adjustments necessary. So what we're going to do, we're going to take this Jeep down to a shop that we work with a lot for various exhaust, and we're going to have this welded in. Now, if you're a good welder, you've got the tools and the knowledge on how to drill that hole and weld that bung in, absolutely go ahead and do it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start by taking the fuel line from the fuel pump to the carburetor off, so we can get that out of the way, give us a little more room to work. And then we can remove the vacuum lines that we have off of here, as well as the power for the electronic choke. So simple as that. Now we're ready to start removing the base to get this carburetor itself off of here. And we'll get that air filter out of the way. Now there's one additional item that needs to be unhooked at this point, and that is the throttle linkage. So I'll get that loosened up and taken off real quick, and we will be ready to remove this carburetor. Okay, now that we've got the carburetor removed, the fuel lines removed, the vacuum lines unhooked, as well as the electronics for the electric choke, our next step, we need to get underneath the vehicle and access the main fuel supply line. Now that we've got the fuel line cut and capped off for the time being, our next step, we're going to need to put this gasket as well as this adapter plate on top of the intake manifold. So once we do that, what we're going to want to do is get some RTV sealant, some silicone. Once these bolts are tightened, we need to make a mound of sealant that needs to sit on there from 4 to 24 hours. The reason for that is once we put that other gasket and the throttle body unit on it, this will eliminate the possibility of any vacuum leaks. So we're going to put this on, put the adapter plate on, and then put the RTV sealant up here to give it a chance to set up while we do some of the other things. Okay, now again we're going to just open this intake up, pull all of this tape off of here, make sure that we've got a good clean surface. All right, everything feels good. We'll go ahead and put the gasket in place. Bolt this adapter plate down, and again, once we have it tightened and in place, we'll go ahead and cover these 4 caps with the RTV sealant. We will mount it on top of these 4 bolts here, and we'll let that sit anywhere from 4 to 24 hours before we put the gasket and throttle body on top of it. So we're going to let that sit for now. While we're still working around and over it, I'm just going to stuff this in to once again keep anything from falling into that intake manifold. Our next step within the engine compartment is to remove that mechanical fuel pump. Howell has provided a plate as well as a gasket, so what we can do, we'll remove that mechanical fuel pump and block that port off with this little unit here. From there, where we had cut the fuel line underneath, we're going to adapt the fuel filter as well as the electronic inline fuel pump together, and we're going to mount those on the frame rail underneath and then connect it to where we had cut that supply line earlier. Okay, so again, we're going to remove this manual fuel pump, and this whole supply line is what we cut from the other side. It will be eliminated, and where this fuel pump mounts into the engine block, we'll block things off with this. So it's a very simple process to get these pieces off of here. A couple of bolts, and again, this will be replaced with the electric inline fuel pump that we will mount. So again, we've got the gasket and plate that will mount right onto there. We'll grab a rag real quick, clean that surface up, and put everything back. Okay, now that we've got the mechanical fuel pump off of there, we'll go ahead and put this supply gasket and plate on it. We did clean things up to make sure that this mounting surface is nice and clean and dry before we put this together. But as you can see, it's a very simple replacement. You just pull these 2 bolts out, remove that mechanical fuel pump, and install the gasket and plate. Tighten it down, and we're done and ready to move on to adapting that fuel filter to the fuel pump, and we'll get that mounted underneath the vehicle. Alright, now that we've had a chance to let this RTV sealer set up a little bit, we've got the fuel pump, the fuel filter, everything mounted down below, the mechanical fuel pump taken off, again all the fuel lines, the vacuum lines, the power feed for the electronic choke on the old carburetor. Now it's time to take the gasket and our throttle body, and we'll get those mounted on this adapter plate. We'll kind of clean up around the edges, make sure everything is good, nice and clean before we set this down, mount that on there and tighten it up. Then we'll get ready to start running some wire here shortly. All right. And as you can see, you might be able to see the hole in some spots. If you can get 2 out of the 3 lined up, then generally you can wiggle things around slightly and get that 3rd one to start. Now, since this is an aluminum base that we're going to screw into, you don't want to tighten it down with excessive force. Strip those threads out, then you'll have huge problems on your hands, and you don't want to fight or mess with that. So what we need to do is get in here, and this temp sensor for the coolant is going to come out. We're going to replace it with this, the new sensor. So what we need to do is pull this out. We're going to have to be quick about it because we haven't drained all of the coolant out of this system. So we're going to pull this out once we get this thread taped, and we will pull this out, put the new one in, and it'll be ready for the new wiring harness, since obviously the plug-ins are different. Get some of the stuff out of our way. Now you can also use a plug that's in the block, but we opted to use this existing port in the manifold just for ease and accessibility. Okay, we didn't get it wrapped up in one day like we hoped, but it was well worth taking the extra time. We needed to sort out a few wires that we still need to keep that will go in conjunction with the new wiring harness from Howell. But in addition to that, we wanted to clean up stuff like this. You never know when you buy a vehicle from somebody else or something like this that is approaching 30 years old. You never know what kind of fixes were made by who. So we're going to clean this type of stuff up so when we're out in the woods we don't have to worry about a fire, we don't have to worry about breaking down, and we know that we can trust it. So as you can see, we've got a few wires strung out here. We've got the throttle body protected, so while we're working on this type of stuff, nothing drops down into the new throttle body. So you want to protect that as well. But we're going to clean this up, see if we can get this thing running here in the next hour or two. Now that we got the wiring cleaned up, as you can see, we've mocked up the wiring where we're going to go. I like to use a lot of zip ties. The reasons for that, you can keep it organized. You can route the wiring that you know you're going to have in one section of the vehicle or another. And it just helps keep things clean, kind of keeps the mind straight on what you're working on, what wire goes to where. Our next step, we're getting ready to put the new wiring harness into the cab where we'll mount the ECM. What I've taken was the factory boot here, just made a little slice in one side. You can open it up, that way we can reuse it. We can use the old boot with the new wiring harness, and then once we have that in place and direct the rest of our wiring, we can put it all together, put it in a nice clean loom. When I do power wires, sometimes I will use red loom. It gives me a sense of, again, what is where, and it keeps separation as well as organization. So we're ready. We're going to start putting this ECM in, doing the wiring, fire this little beauty up. Okay, now that we've got the new wires pulled into the cab portion of the vehicle, it's time to put the new ECM in the tray and mount that back in here. So you want to leave things nice and loose while you do this portion of the install, so that way you'll have room to connect the wires. As you can see, there's a little bit of cramped quarters there to try and work, but again, just make sure everything's out of the way. Time to get this hooked up. Okay, now that we've got the new wiring harness through the firewall, the ECM is mounted and hooked up. These are just items that are going to plug into the water temperature sensor. We've got some vacuum line stuff. We've got the throttle position sensor. Over here we've got the power for the fuel pump, so that will get dropped down and plugged into its respective area. A couple wires here that go to the battery, the tach, and the starter solenoid. Went ahead and left this stuff open so we can add things like this into that wire loom. This actually a tach wire as well, so we're just routing and getting ready to do the final hookup on this. Fire this thing up here shortly. Alright, now for the moment of truth. As you can see, we've got the throttle body mounted, all the vacuum lines hooked up, the new wiring harness through the firewall, everything connected. The old wires are still just kind of temporarily put in place right here. We've got to make sure that everything is going to run. If we need to do any diagnostics, check anything within the passenger compartment. So once everything is confirmed, once all the gauges are working, everything is hooked up correctly, everything is confirmed, then we will put all of this in wire loom. But for now, we're going to see if this guy's going to fire up. So let's give it a shot. Not bad. We've got this thing going. We're going to give it a couple minutes. There's a bit of a learning curve as this thing
adjust the ECM unit that is mounted inside of the passenger compartment will do a little learning. It's going to adjust accordingly to the temperature, the altitude. That's where all the electronics come together to tell this what to do to keep performance. So we're going to give it a couple minutes, let it run. We're going to check our gauges, make sure that the oil pressure works. The voltmeter, everything that was operating before, we want to make sure that it's still operating now that we've changed the wiring. Again, once all of this is dialed in, everything is confirmed, we'll clean this up further by putting it in a new wire loom. But at this point, I couldn't be happier that it fired right up. There is a 10-inch air cleaner that will need to be installed on this. So when we're done here, we'll put the new air cleaner on, wrap things up, we'll get this thing out on the trail and check out this new fuel injection system from Howell.
While we were letting it run, got inside the cab to check things out, just to make sure again that all the gauges were working correctly, everything from the fuel, the voltage, the oil pressure. For some reason, the oil pressure is not reading right. So we're going to do a little diagnostics on that, find out what's going on, and try and fix that. Once we've got that done, this is going to be ready to wrap up. We've gone ahead and put things together within the passenger compartment. We've mounted the little fuse panel, our diagnostics port, everything that needs to be done inside is put back together. We're going to figure out what's going on with this oil sending unit, get that ready, fixed up, and then we're going to slap the 10-inch air cleaner on here, do a final check, make sure everything is clean, wrapped up, out of the way, and how we want it, and we're ready to go. So thanks to Howell. This has been a great install, very informative. Their instructions, if you are the type of person that is a do-it-yourselfer, as long as you've got the patience, some good mechanical knowledge, this is a project that you can handle. But again, you want to make sure that you're comfortable with wiring. You want to do things right. This is not the area to do things part way. So you want to do it clean, you want to do it correctly, and you want to take the time necessary to get the job done right. But we're very anxious to get this thing out on the trail, stuff it up against some rocks, and see how this is going to perform at angles, different elevations. And again, we're very happy with the install, the way things went. Great system from Howell, so we're anxious to see what it's going to do.